this evening. Thank you all for joining us either this evening or this afternoon or the morning, where I think it's still before noon for Professor Mark Lawall, who's going to be giving our presentation today. As you know, this is a joint online seminar organized by the American Research Institute Turkey, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and the Mustafa V Koç Maritime Archaeology Research Center at Koç University. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank everyone involved, including Zeynep and Tuba and all the other representatives of those organizations, because I'm really happy with the way this seminar series has been progressing. And so it's very nice to see all of you here today. Now, similar to our other online seminars, we will be recording this event today. And if you're interested, please feel free to visit either the ERIT webpage on YouTube, in which you can see the other seminars we've recorded, or you can also go to the KUDAR webpage for the Koç University one, where you can find links to those presentations. Now, as always, there will be an opportunity for questions and discussion after Professor Lawall's talk. And I want to remind everyone right now, just please turn off your microphones during the seminar. We've had some strange interruptions in the past, I think from a couple dogs and perhaps a parrot. I'll attempt to moderate the questions and answers afterwards, and we can take questions both within the chat and we can also take questions live. Now, our guest today is Professor Mark Lawall. He's from the Department of Classics at the University of Manitoba, and he has been based there since the completion of his PhD in 1995. He is the recipient of over 25 grants, fellowships, and awards from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the National Endowment of Humanities in North America, and the American School in Athens. And he's coming home in a way. He's received support from the American Research Institute in Turkey as well. He's a very prolific author and scholar. He's focused not only on amphoras and their typology, but as Berslan has explained to me very patiently, he's also looking more at the entire archaeological context and the entire meaning of the way we can interpret these amphoras as well as part of the archaeological record. And so it's that approach that often provides us with new insights regarding the datings and origins of these objects. Now, today, Professor Lawall will be discussing his latest project, which is a study of the transport amphoras from the late Classical era shipwreck recovered off the northern coast of Cyprus in 1968 and 1969. And it is presently on display in the Crusader era castle in Kyrenia. So, Professor Lawall, Mark, it's all to you now. Thank you very much for coming.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. And I want to echo what Matthew was saying about my appreciation of all three organizations who have organized this this seminar. Let me just check that the proper presentation or proper view is on screen for everybody here. All good. Okay, great. Yes, so my title is The Long Voyage of the Kyrenia Amphoras, 1968 to 2024. And this all started because of an article on CNN, which is a rare example of CNN caring about the date of a shipwreck. The recent results of radiocarbon dating from the Kyrenia wreck seem to be, according to them at least, of sufficient interest to launch the ship once more into broad public awareness, at least for a day or so before it got knocked off by any number of amazing pieces of news from the US. Those results suggested shifting the date of the wreck about a decade further into the 3rd century BC, perhaps to 286, 278 BC, than had been suggested on the basis of the coins and the amphoras. What I want to consider today is whether this late date is correct, and if so, what are the implications for understanding the Kyrenia ship as evidence for ancient shipping and trade. My lecture begins with a review of how the dating of the amphora cargo has developed since it was first raised between 1967 and 1969. As the suggested date for the cargo has shifted from the late 4th century BC to the 280s or even 270s, the likelihood increases that some or many of the jars were already fairly old when they were used on the Kyrenia ship. The various points of origin represented by the amphoras, their varying states of preservation, and possibly even states of completeness at the time of the sinking, as well as the carefully documented evidence for the arrangement of the jars on the ship, all come together to shed light on this unique chapter of ancient economic history. The Kyrenia shipwreck, as many of you probably know, is located just off the north coast of Cyprus, about 800 meters from shore and 1,200 meters from the modern city of Kyrenia, Kyrenia. In 1965, a Cypriot diver and underwater tour guide, Andreas Kariolu, first discovered the wreck while anchoring his boat and hunting for sponges during a storm. In 1967, while still a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, Michael Katsev received permission to carry out an underwater survey off the coast of Cyprus, and he was led to the site of Kyrenia by Kariolu. A survey of the site carried out that year in 1967 provided Michael Katsev with enough imagery to approach Virginia Grace, the leading scholar of amphora studies at the time, for advice on the identification of the cargo and the date of the wreck. Virginia Grace had worked through the 1930s, mostly on amphoras at the Athenian Agora, and then she spent the war years doing intelligence work in Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, and Turkey. She then spent the late 1940s in Princeton before returning to post-war Greece in 1949. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Grace had spent a great deal of time studying amphoras in the storerooms of the castle on the island of Rhodes. And there, she was able to document early Rhodian forms that preceded the more canonical Hellenistic stamped amphoras. These photos from Grace's files document some of those early Rhodian forms. From Grace's perspective in 1967, the forms like those at Kyrenia represented nearly the earliest known Rhodian amphora forms, and so she suggested a date late in the 4th century as most likely for the wreck. And I show you a quote here from Michael Katsev's notes from November 1967. As full-scale excavations proceeded through the 1968 and 1969 seasons, new evidence for the date of the wreck became available. A cache of thousands of almonds allowed for radiocarbon dating, the results of which suggested a date centering on 288 BC, but with a fairly wide error range of 62 years, indicating a 65% likelihood of the actual date falling sometime between 350 and 226 BC. Somewhat more promising was the numismatic evidence, in particular the coin at the top of this slide, attributed to Ptolemy I, and at that time dated between 310 and 306 BC. That date could fit within the error range of the radiocarbon dates for the almonds. The numismatic date and the almonds dates, however, started compressing the Rhodian chronology as Virginia Grace understood things in the late 1960s. And here I have to back up to a different excavation, and that is those at Kyrenia in southern Attica. For 3 weeks back in 1960, a small team of Americans led by Eugene Vanderpool had excavated at that southern Attic site of Kyrenia, marked with the red cross on this slide. There, they found not only a wide range of amphoras that you see on the lower part of this slide, but also amphora stamps and coins, most of which dated to the reign of Ptolemy II. Vanderpool and his colleagues argued that this was the site of a Ptolemaic encampment in Attica during the time of the poorly understood Crimonidean War of the late 260s BC. Grace, however, responded that the Rhodian amphoras at Kyrenia dated not beyond the late 4th century. But if the much earlier looking Kyrenia jars were also late 4th century, then something had to give. Through the late 1960s and early 1970s, Grace and her colleagues in Athens rechecked the lists of annually appointed priests whose names appear on Rhodian amphora stamps. These would be the eponym stamps. Grace was able to reevaluate the absolute chronology of the Rhodian eponyms by studying finds from major sites with known dates of abandonment, groups of stamps under buildings of known construction date, or batches of stamps assignable on historical grounds to specific periods. So in an article published in 1974, she argued that the names appearing at Kyrenia dated to the 270s instead of the late 4th century. This shift in the Rhodian chronology opened space for the Kyrenia ship's Rhodian amphoras much closer to the numismatic date of shortly after 306 BC. Thus, the Kyrenia ship entered the research literature as a late 4th century shipwreck. When Michael Katsev died in 2001, the field of amphora studies was seeing significant changes in many areas. That year, Gerald Finkelstein published a new chronology for Rhodian amphora stamps that moved the sequence later by just over a decade. So, for example, those Kyrenia Rhodians now coincided with the historical accounts associating the site with the Chromonidean War of the late 260s instead of the 270s. But if the Rhodian chronology was sliding later, was it possible that the Kyrenia wreck date should also shift into the 3rd century? In 2002, Susan Katsev invited my participation on the project to complete the publication of the Kyrenia shipwreck. Among the top priorities was, of course, to pin down the date of the wreck and its cargo. Many other issues would depend on that question. So why was that date so difficult? After all, we had stamped Rhodian amphoras, and Finkelstein had just refined their dates with tables lining up names with specific years. Unfortunately, the earliest stamps, as are found on the Kyrenia amphoras, fall before those names that Finkelstein could confidently place in the chronological sequence. The names are heavily abbreviated, as you see here, and it's not always clear how to fill out the name with the abbreviation, the name referred to by the abbreviation. Think of how many names in ancient Greek start with alpha, rho, iota: Aristotle, Aristophanes, Aristides, Aristogeiton, and on and on and on. Greeks love names that start with the best. There are often two names indicated on Rhodian amphoras, and this is as true of the Kyrenia jars as it is for later Rhodian amphoras. One is the annual priest name, often indicated on later stamps by the preposition epi, or in the term of. The other name is conventionally termed the fabricant, a role that remains quite undefined. But in the case of the Kyrenia jars, neither name is preceded by the preposition epi. From my initial readings of the stamps, it seemed that there were at least 5 different pairings of names, as you see listed here. Assuming one name in each pair is the eponym, we might have at least 4 or 5 different years represented on the stamps. Further study, however, showed that one of the pairs was not Rhodian at all, but from a workshop near Knidos, and the monogram should be read as Pa-si instead of Pa-go. So we are down now to 3 or 4 Rhodian years. So which are the eponyms and which are the fabricants? Michael Katsev had already noted one pattern. On some stamps with both names on the same stamp, the upper name tended to stay constant, while the lower name changed. The upper name, therefore, should be the fabricant, a position held for multiple years, while the lower name was that of the eponym. By this line of reasoning, then, Nika, shown here, is a fabricant, and its paired names, Alex and Timo, would be the eponyms. From there, if Nika is in fact, if Timo is an eponym, then Ion must be the fabricant that is paired with Timo. This pattern, in fact, fits well with the impression one has from the details of the jars themselves. Jars potted under the same fabricant tend to look more similar to one another than jars potted under the same eponym but different fabricants. If, and this is not certain, fabricants worked in some capacity with specific workshops, then we should expect more similarity within fabricant groups than between fabricants. Indeed, many of our jars, marked only with the stamp alpha rho iota, show very close similarity with one another in the shape of the rim, the form of the neck, and even the long curving profile of the shoulders. There is an interesting exception, however. On 2 jars, Ari is on the second line below Dio. Dio seems to be in the fabricant position, and as it happens, the rim is completely different. So in this case, is Ari actually the eponym? Instead, it seems that Dio simply does not follow the rule. Dio appears in the eponym position with a known fabricant Moskos, so the mu omicron sigma is at the top of this circular stamp, or Moskos, on the stamp you see here from Naucritus. But in a different stamp with Moskos, he again appears on the top line. So Dio does seem to be an eponym, and perhaps a difference in date between the bulk of the Ari circle stamped amphoras and these two with Dio plus Ari explains the variant rim forms. In another case, we have a Timar stamp paired with Ale. So which is the eponym here? On another stamp, not from Kyrenia, Nika, a fabricant, also appears over Alex. So perhaps Ale is the eponym and Timar is the fabricant. There are in fact very many known Timar stamps around the Greek world, and this might indicate his identity as a very prolific fabricant. So to sum up so far, we have Timo, Ale or Alex, and Dio as eponyms, so 3 different years. But which years? Are they consecutive or are there gaps between them? Finkelstein argued that stamps of the sort found at Kyrenia should fall between 294, right after Rhodian amphoras were marked with a datable coin image stamp, and 270, when the more securely understood period 1b of Rhodian stamping started. Finkelstein based his dates on the knowledge of about 24 early abbreviated eponym stamps, such as we have at Kyrenia, before 270, hence he got his starting date of 294. More recent work by Nathan Badoud added 9 more abbreviations to get to 33, hence pushing the start to perhaps 303 BC. About this same time, in the early 2000s, Christian Habicht and Nathan Badoud both argued independently that the eponyms on the Rhodian stamps were indeed the priests of Halios, the sun god. Scholars had long suspected that there should be some connection between the eponyms and these priests, since the word priest, or an image of the sun, even appears on the stamps. Virginia Grace and others, however, found too many discrepancies between the sequence of the stamps and the surviving epigraphical lists of the priests of Halios. Habicht and Badoud showed that using Finkelstein's chronology with only some minor shifts brought the best understood periods of Rhodian stamping, in fact, right into line with the known dates of the priests. So it should be easy enough to find priests whose names fit the abbreviations we have. Unfortunately, for the earliest Rhodian stamps, we rarely know the actual name involved. And then just as we get into the 3rd century, the lists of priests of Halios breaks off in 298 BC. Even so, some tantalizing possibilities do arise in the surviving lists. A Timostratus, priest in 313, could be our Timo. Aleximachos, priest in 301, could be our Alex. For Dio, we have various possibilities. Diogenes in 316, Dioxippus in 309, and Diopathes, whose name is actually spelled out completely on some amphora stamps and even labeled there as priest. But unfortunately, these stamps of Diopathes appear on amphoras of a shape that seems later than those seen at Kyrenia. Diopathes may date as late as the 270s. At any rate, his name does not appear before 298 on the epigraphical lists. If these early stamps only, however, post-date the coin type stamps, and only appear after 303 or after 294, depending, then most of these expansions of the abbreviations to known priest names cannot work. They're simply too early. But that starting date is based on the shaky assumption that the coin type stamp must predate all other stamping practices. And this is a demonstrably false assumption elsewhere. And that the earliest Rhodian stamping system was as rigorous and rational as it would become later in the Hellenistic period. We could easily have gaps, similar abbreviations to very different people, and so on, that would push the start of Rhodian stamping well before 303. As it happens, though, other lines of evidence point to the early 3rd century for at least some of the Rhodian stamps found at the Kyrenia shipwreck. Another clue for the dates of the Kyrenia stamps comes from the excavations at Ephesus in the early 1990s. In strata below the early Hellenistic agora, excavators uncovered a shallow well filled with complete amphoras of various types, including 2 Rhodians of the form found at Kyrenia. This well had been dug through leveling fill over the pre-Hellenistic settlement, and then itself was covered over by the earliest agora level. It was reasonably associated, therefore, with the deliberate relocation and refoundation of the city of Ephesus by Lysimachus, which took place no earlier than 294 BC and no later than Lysimachus's death in 281. One of the 2 nearly complete Rhodian amphoras in that well deposit carries the stamp Nika on one handle and Lucy or Lysi on the other. This puts our Kyrenian fabricant Nika as active in the early 3rd century, though he might well have had a career stretching back into the 4th century or ahead beyond 281 BC. Another piece of evidence pointing to the very early 3rd century for the Rhodian stamps and amphoras on the Kyrenia ship comes from a deposit on the island of Rhodes itself from the construction of the sanctuary of Isis. The sanctuary itself appears to have been set up in the aftermath of Ptolemy I's assistance to Rhodes during Demetrius Poliorcetes' siege that ended in 304 BC. Exactly how long after that date the temple was built, however, is not certain. One of the Rhodian fabricant names from the Kyrenia group, Timar, appears on a jar with the eponym Agelochos from the construction deposit at the Isis sanctuary. This is in the upper left of this slide. This is the earliest of the 4 stamped Rhodian jar tops published from the Isis sanctuary. A jar stamped with the eponym Aristion shows a more steeply sloping rim, which may be a later form than the triangular rim of the Agelochos jar. A date for this batch in the 290s would not be too far distant in time from Ptolemy's assistance for the sanctuary to serve as a thank offering. So far, so pre-pandemic. In 2023, though, we've finished the first volume of the Kyrenia report series, thankfully, and the mid-290s date went to press. Earlier this year, however, as I mentioned before, Kyrenia and the date of its calamitous end were national news, very much to my surprise. Some parts of this slide are, of course, fictitious. Sturt Manning and his colleagues re-examined the dendrochronological and carbon-14 evidence for the date of the ship's construction and the date of the wreck. They had found significant discrepancies between calibrated carbon-14 dates and tree ring dates for the broad period between 450 and 150 BC, and particularly important for us, especially between 350 and 250 BC. Using modern methods of accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS, radiocarbon dating, to get carbon-14 dates from tree rings of known date, Manning and his colleagues were able to correct the calibration curve for the 4th and 3rd centuries. From here, they were able to generate a series of likely dates for the timber and other wood elements used in the ship's construction and repair, and a series of likely dates for the almonds, a twig from brush used to cushion the amphora cargo, and a sheep knuckle bone. The combined evidence for the date of construction and repair is seen in graph B in the upper right of this slide, most likely in the 340s to 310s. The date of the wreck event itself is shown in graph C as most likely in the 280s to 270s. This second graph shows the overlap of different ways of modeling the probability of the date of the wreck as narrowing in on the period 286 to 272, and perhaps even narrower of 286 to 278. And before a flood of questions come in about the statistics, I will say that I cannot answer them. I know nothing about this. I'm basically basing this purely on my own fairly uncertain reading of Manning's article. So how do we explain this gap of at least a decade, perhaps two, between the apparent date of the stamps and the date indicated by the radiocarbon results? The first possibility is that Manning and his colleagues are completely wrong, and we ceramicists and epigraphers are completely right. This seems highly unlikely, so we'll set that aside. Second, they are completely right, and we are right, in at least the relative order of the Rhodian chronology. In that case, the absolute chronology, though, would have to be lowered by at least a decade, if not two, for the Rhodian stamps. And that gets us into historical impossibilities, like a flourishing trade in imported Rhodian amphoras at Carthage in the years immediately after Carthage was sacked in 146. So we'll set that possibility aside as well. Third, they are right, but we need to rethink the admittedly very poorly understood Rhodian amphora chronology before circa 270 BC. This last option, is by far the most productive. First, remember that there are multiple eponym stamps on the Kyrenia Rhodians. At least 3 different years are present, and if those 3 years are not consecutive, then an even broader time span is represented by the amphoras. The similarity in shapes and overlap in stamps with that Ephesus well I mentioned earlier of the late 290s exerts some gravitational pull to keep the Kyrenia jars earlier than later in the period before 270 BC. And the modest coin assemblage would fit better with a date before 294 or around 294, given the extreme scarcity of Ptolemaic coinage on a ship operating in what would then be a solidly Ptolemaic economic sphere. But again, the coin assemblage is very small, so there's plenty of space for chance to intervene in what we actually have preserved. The Rhodian amphoras, however, are not alone on the wreck. There are also jars from the area of Samos and probably other areas of Ionia and the nearby islands. There are jars from Paros, Knidos, and perhaps Kos, as well as Cyprus, the Levantine coast, and Egypt. In some cases, these are not closely datable forms, but where the forms are well attested elsewhere, the evidence does suggest a date in the late 4th through early 3rd century. But again, there's plenty of space for wiggle room in this chronology. There are also 2 other Rhodian types, both lacking stamps, that appear in the cargo. Full-size jars on the left side of this slide with a narrow rounded rim, and very small jars of varying shapes, but also with a narrow rounded rim on the middle and right-hand sides. Neither of these types is closely datable or even well paralleled elsewhere, and frankly, they've always baffled me. Once I am faced with Manning's and colleagues' evidence for a 280s or even early 270s date for the wreck, these jars might in fact hold the key for a solution. If one considers the broader picture of Rhodian amphora development and the chronological sequence of the forms used, we tend to move from a thick triangular mushroom rims, such as you see at the Kyrenia wreck, and as you see here on the sequence, the first jar in the upper row there on the left. And we move to taller rims and wider bodies, as you see as we move towards the right on the upper row here. And then to rounded rims, as you see across the bottom row, till we get to the canonical Rhodian form of the Hellenistic period on the lower right corner here. But the reality is not at all, excuse me, as linear as this slide might imply. Close study of the eponyms and fabricants associated with these forms show, for example, that the Kyrenia form overlaps the next form, so this form and the next one right next to it, at least in the priesthood of Cleagoras. Cleagoras's date must be post-298, since he does not appear on the preserved lists which stop in that year. So the overlap could occur in the 290s, it could occur in the 280s, or even later. As far as the rounded rim amphoras go, type 3 here shows the same eponyms as type 3.1 here. And this overlap seems to occur in the 260s. The same is true for eponyms found on this type 2 here and type 3.2 here, again, already in the 270s. But I had no reason to think at the time that the Kyrenia rounded rim Rhodian jars were anywhere close to that period of transition or overlapping forms in the 260s or even earlier in the 270s. Manning and colleagues' results, however, pull us a bit closer and open up an interesting possibility. Perhaps in the 280s, Rhodian potters were still mostly making jars of the Kyrenia form, while also experimenting with rounded rim forms and starting to shift to that next wider-bodied Rhodian 1.2 form. Our oldest Kyrenia stamped Rhodians, remember we have at least 3 years and probably more, can still be back close to Ephesus in the 290s, but others might be creeping closer to the 280s. Remember the abbreviated eponym Dio. It could now be expanded to Diopathes, which appears explicitly as an eponym on one of those wider-bodied Rhodian 1.2 jars. Perhaps this is another instance of overlap between the Kyrenia form jars and the squatter, wider Rhodian 1.2 jars. Remember, we had Cleagoras already overlapping those two. But I had excluded this expansion of the abbreviation before, since it seemed far too late, but perhaps that's no longer the case. So by the 280s, Rhodian workshops may have been producing the tall triangular rim Kyrenia jars, the wider body type Rhodian 1.2, and jars with Rhodian rims, both full-sized and fractional. It does mean that some of the goods packed in Rhodian amphoras used pretty old jars, perhaps a decade old, if not more. That circumstance might explain why some are missing handles and the brakes are with very worn down brakes, and why the stamps themselves are often very worn, and even why some of the rims that Katza thought were rounded were actually broken and worn triangular rims. Thanks to the painstaking work both underwater during the excavations and on land afterwards, scrutinizing the photographic archives of the project, Susan Katzev and Linus Sweeney were able to plot every single amphora, color-coded, and they color-coded them by the different amphora types on these 3 layers of the Rex excavation. From their work, it is clear that the older and newer Rhodian forms are all combined through the main cargo. Even the small fractional rounded rim Rhodians are spread across the middle layer before clustering to one side in the lowest layer. We tend to think of cargoes as comprising artifacts all of one date, but Kyrenia reminds us that this is not always the case. For some reason, and by some process on land that escapes our knowledge, the cargo is packed into Rhodian containers new and old, and even some non-Rhodian containers that were likely all part of the same loading process. But before this cobbled together shipment of perhaps wine was stowed in the middle of the ship, the goods carried in the large but unfortunately fragile Samian amphoras were stowed near the prow, likely under decking, and in the stern. Even there, however, the Samian jars may have been mixed with single examples of similarly large rotund jars from Kos and elsewhere in the vicinity. So this final loading appears to involve basically 2 consignments. But in neither case was the consignment tidily contained all in the newest jars, nor all even in the same types of jars. The Kyrenia ship continues to challenge us to figure out just where and how cargoes were assembled, how exporters interacted with merchants, merchants with shippers, and shippers with importers. That is, if the shippers ever got the chance to interact with the importers, which was not the case for Kyrenia because it sank. Manning's study forced me to throw out some of my preconceived notions and prejudices, and this is a major accomplishment in the academic world, as many of you know. taken in conjunction with the wide range of other studies commissioned by Susan Katsev and cajoled, herded, encouraged, and otherwise assisted both by her and Linus Sweeney, Manning's work highlights an even broader conclusion. Shipwrecks need to be studied from as many angles as possible. They're not just simple snapshots of the past that can be understood through a few samples, but with time, their secrets can be revealed. Thank you very much.
All right, Mark, thank you very much for that very thorough and enlightening presentation. I greatly appreciate it. Now, I know I was taking a lot of notes and I have a handful of questions, but I'm sure many people in the audience do as well. So please feel free. You can put questions in the chat, as I said previously, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand and hopefully I will see you and we can call on you. So any questions to start off? Well, I have one then. You mentioned at the very beginning, and what's clear throughout your presentation is that a number of the amphora are clearly rather old when they were put into use and reused and so on and so forth. And I'm curious if that's something you find on other sites, either on land or underwater for this period of time, because with my experience, that's something I see in the late Roman Byzantine period, but it's not something I attributed to earlier amphoras. Is that common in your?
Well, in fact, one of the things that really struck me as I was thinking about this paper and thinking about Manning's results and so on was that it's almost as if the Kyrenia shipwreck assemblage starts to look like a typical land assemblage, where in a lot of, for example, a large well deposit, you'll get a kind of bulge of amphora remains that are maybe 20 years or more earlier than the final closing of the well. And then you get this sort of tail off down to the actual closing date of the well. So it's almost as if it's the same with this cargo, that they're kind of using what they can get, right? And then they can only get a few of the latest stuff, the latest, most up-to-date pieces. I think a place where I hope that this same kind of thing might be able to be studied would be at the Cerce Limane Hellenistic wreck, which is now being, as you all know, being re-examined and further work being done there. Because there again we have stamped jars, and you can look at again just how many years are represented from those jars and just from the stamps, and then perhaps also we can reconsider how the shapes affect our conclusions. But for this period, for the Hellenistic period and the classical period, we don't have that many wrecks where we can really study the full cargo in detail to really know this kind of thing. So Kyrenia stands out in that regard, really. Still.
Interesting. There's also a site off the southern coast of Cyprus that Stella has been working on. It's very similar in date. Have you had a chance to look at that material as well? Are there similarities?
Yeah, so this is the Mazotas wreck that, in fact, Manning also studied some timber and other material from that wreck, and came up again with a in that case quite different date from what Stella Domestica had suggested for the wreck. My view is, I mean, none of those forms on the Mazotas wreck are anywhere closely as datable as these Rhodians at Kyrenia. And I suspect, again, by thinking about the radiocarbon dates, thinking about what's absolutely necessary as far as the amphora dates, there's probably we can probably come to an agreement. Okay. It's sort of a negotiation, really. I think these things are always kind of a matter of negotiation.
Yeah, I can see that. And speaking of negotiations, I have a question from Deborah Carlson at INA, in fact. She's asking regarding well, I'll read it. With all the juggling and the jockeying of stamps and analyses, she's curious if we ever question the eponym lists from Rose, because so much seems to hinge on them, and surely they're more reliable than the Athenian tribute quota lists. But is it right that they are never questioned? Or perhaps in my case, are they being questioned and we simply don't?
Yeah, so Nathan Badoud published in 2015, I think it was, a very detailed examination of all the surviving lists and all the surviving lists that mention other priests, so that, because the idea has always been that the Rhodian priesthoods tend to be almost like a cursus honorum.
Mm.
So if we know if somebody was a priest of Athena, for example, at one point, then we can kind of predict that at some later date they're going to be a priest of Halios and so on. So anyways, yeah, so Badud has studied these in great detail. There's still a certain amount of debate about them, but I would say they're between his work, Thibaut Castelli's work, and others. We're amazingly close. You
Mm.
know, and John Lund has also worked on this. We're much closer than ever in terms of understanding, you know, those sequences. But that's
Okay.
not, it's going to be, it still doesn't help us that much for before about 270 BC.
Mm. I
So,
see. I see. Ah, there's a question here from Athena in Denmark. She's curious if this evidence of reuse and the long-term ongoing use of the amphoras, if there's anything that can be said about the contents. You know, were they all carrying wine? Were they carrying other contents? Were they traveling as empties possibly? And then actually, in addition to that, my question to add to that would be, can you see that sequence if the contents are changing from one to the other use?
the evidence, as far as I understand it at Kyrenia, is that and they tried a lot of different methods of examining contents,
Mm.
trace elements of those contents, and none of them were as clear cut as we might want. So no, we can't tell precisely that, for example, the Rhodians contained wine.
Mm.
Um, the in some ways the most what I wanted to be in many ways the most obvious contents are the almonds. And some of the almonds are found in these very large Samian jars. But unfortunately, as Susan and Lina showed in their volume, um, those almonds moved around a lot thanks to the
Mm.
octopuses. And so it's hard to know, you know, what was actually containing the almonds. Um, in my chapter, I tried to look at, you know, if the Samian jars were, for example, containing oil, which is the sort of standard line on what Samian amphoras contained, um, then, you know, what would the possible value of that be versus wine? Um, I mean, it's interesting because olive oil is far, far more valuable on a unit basis than wine. And so
Mm.
just a few of those Samian jars with oil would in fact be the most valuable thing on the ship,
Yeah.
um, if that was the case. Um, but yeah, for a while I played around with the idea that the Rhodian jars, that are many of them very damaged, um, were in fact in a state of actually being shipped as empty, you know, simply empty pieces of clay, basically. They do have these worn holes in them, but statistically, if you look at how the jars with holes are distributed across the wreck, there is
Mm.
absolutely no pattern to that. And it does seem that it's from movement underwater, which is what Susan and Lina argued as well. So
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and you mentioned the Samian jars, and I think there were two in the bow and one at the stern. Is that right?
no, that was it's a bit unclear. I mean, the
Okay.
plans are very small. They're actually the larger number is found in the prow,
Okay.
under sort of decking at the front of the ship. Um, the ones at the stern area near the back cabin are much more fragmentary.
Mhm.
So, but they're a good number back there as well. So it's kind of divided between the two. Yeah.
Is it possible that they perhaps were not cargo, that they were like, owned by the crew or the captain, that's why they were there?
That's certainly possible. Again, one thing that's interesting about those jars is that their capacity is much larger than the Rhodians, and so yeah, in a way that might fit. You know, if they were holding large amounts of crew provisions, that would certainly fit with that. We
Mhm.
do certainly have their three Levantine jars in the after cabin that were surely holding crew's provisions. Um,
Okay. Are there any other questions for Mark? I feel like I'm taking up the entire discussion here. Mark, I think you've answered everyone's questions. They have everything they need to know about the Kyrenia ship and its chronology.
Excellent. For more information, read the book.
Yeah, indeed. That's on my list.
Yeah. Um, anyways, yeah, thanks. That's great.
Mark, thank you very much again. I really appreciate your time and spending it with us. All this information is very, very useful and valuable. And thank you, everyone, for attending this evening.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, wait, I missed a question. I'm so sorry. It's from Charles Gates. He mentions that Herodotus points out that there were piles of old amphorae in the Sinai, and they were presumably put there for reuse. I'm curious if you're aware of this reference.
Yeah. So this Herodotus is explaining, trying to explain why we don't see amphoras more commonly in Egypt, and he mentions that they're they're sort of stockpiled basically along these routes. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where Herodotus is kind of misleading us because especially the excavations at Naucratis and other excavations of Persian period sites in Egypt show plenty of amphoras. So why Herodotus didn't just look around, we don't know. But anyways, yeah, there's certainly plenty of amphoras in Egypt outside those Sinai deposits. Yeah.
Well, if that's the most inaccurate thing Herodotus has ever said, then we're okay.
Exactly.
Well, with that, we also have one more question. Everyone's popping up just at the end. From Elizabeth, she's asking if you could elaborate on what may have driven the change in the shapes of the amphora.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's one of those things where the real challenge is to sort out exactly the chronology, because we tend to think of development of shape as I say, as kind of linear. You move from one shape into another. Whereas thanks to the stamps on the Rhodian amphoras, you can see that in 1 year, different workshops or different potters are actually making different forms, right in Rhodes itself. And what this means this has many implications. One being that the shape of the amphora is not actually that indicative of where it's from. Because you can have 2 or even 3 shapes all from one island, perhaps even from one workshop. We just don't know because we don't have the workshops excavated. So there's that issue. Yeah, there are definitely big long-term trends we can see in amphora shape development. But in fact, Anno Hein at the Democritus Lab in Athens has examined, for example, the strength of different shapes, the resistance to cracking and breakage given different shapes. And so there's certain shapes that do seem to be, in fact, more efficient on a practical level. But that doesn't explain all the minor variations that we see, which are, there's so many different possibilities.
Do you think there's any perhaps pressure coming from the marketplace as well? People are just preferring a particular shape for whatever reason that we prefer particular, Coca-Cola bottles.
Yeah, no, that could certainly be the case too. And you might well have a situation where where a certain form and its most typical commodity become very popular, for example, and then other sites start to imitate that. So you could certainly have some influence, yeah, from what is selling at a given time, what seems to work at a given time, and then things shift away from that.
Yeah. All right. Are there any other questions before we let Mark go for the day? I don't see
Thank you,
it.
Mark.
Yeah.
Well, to reiterate what Tuba said, Mark, thank you very much. And for everyone attending, thank you very much for coming. It's always nice to think that if these were in person, we would all be applauding and you would hear it. But unfortunately, we can't quite do that online. For everyone who's here, we are planning on having another online seminar with the very same partners in November from one of our colleagues here at Koç University, who wrote a recent book on the maritime cultural landscape of the Red Sea. So we will be passing out more information about that. But once again, Mark, thank you very much for coming. I want to thank everyone in our audience. And please have a good evening, afternoon, or morning. And I'll see everyone soon.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.